listening to This Won't Fix You. I'm your host, Nadine Pittham, and this show is a curation of interesting models, metaphors and images discovered or manifested through my work as an accredited psychotherapist. You can expect to hear nifty ideas, clever language and thought-provoking ways of looking at life. Each episode, you'll get one of two alternating perspectives. First, a conversation which introduces and discusses the theory or idea, and we call this the A side, and then the B side, which, while not therapy, is a deeper exploration of that theory or idea from a more therapeutic standpoint. Hello everybody, today we're talking about the film Gravity. So essentially we're talking about loneliness, isolation, disconnection, and even, I suppose, avoidance. And to do that, I'm joined by Anoushka Beazley again, our film expert. Hi, Anoushka.
Hi, Nadine. It's so nice to be back. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm delighted, and I'm also delighted that we've chosen this film as well, because it's one of my favourites. I loved Frozen, but Gravity is grown-up fare, isn't it?
Well, I have to be honest, I hadn't seen it before you suggested it. Somehow it had escaped me, and so it was. Yeah, well, we'll get into it, but it was really interesting.
A little summary, perhaps, to start us off then, for everybody who may or may not have seen it, but maybe needs a refresh, because it was released in 2013. It's basically, and by all means, give your own version, Anoushka, when I've finished with my little intro. My understanding is that it's basically a metaphor for what it is to have given up on life and what happens when we are plugged back in. So the film tells the story of Dr. Ryan Stone, who's played by Sandra Bullock, and she, along with George Clooney's character, Matt Kowalski, they get stranded in space after the shuttle that they're working from is destroyed by space debris. So they get cut loose. He's got a jetpack for a while, but other than that, they are floating. She is floating in space. And just at the point that she gets hit, or that their shuttle gets hit by the flying debris, just at that point, Ryan Stone is telling Matt Kowalski about her daughter's death, her little daughter, who is 3 or 4, something like that, died in a freak accident. And until that point, Ryan Stone's she's vacant. She's just spaced out, so to speak. And as soon as they get hit, that crisis somehow provokes her re-engagement with life. It's kind of like a rebirth, that she's more alive in the face of extreme adversity than she has been since the death of her daughter. And so while the film is about her attempt to get back to Earth, it's actually a beautiful metaphor for being untethered, disconnected from life because of extreme pain, and what it's like to re-engage. Anoushka, what do you make of that summary? Does that speak to you?
That's spot on, absolutely. It's such a wonderful metaphor, this movie being set in space, because if there can be a perfect setting for grief, I think space would be it. We imagine space as this vast, almost void. I mean, there's actually a lot going on in space, but, for us, most of us humans, we think there's nothing out there. We don't know what's out there. And she's floating around in space. She's carrying around this terrible grief. And this is where we find our characters. We're transported to another world.
A world that in the opening, sometimes that films present, these sort of few lines of text before the film starts, and one of them is something like, life in space is impossible. And they talk about the harshness of the reality of space and the temperature of it, the size and expanse of it. So the world that they are cut loose in, the world that she is in, is impossible. She is not living. She's not thriving. I think that's kind of the message they're setting up. Would you agree?
Absolutely. There's something very brutal. There's something very hostile about that period of grief that we will all find ourselves in at some point in our life. And so Stone's environment there in space it's impossible. We don't know how to manage. These astronauts are out there trying to find out about this galaxy, this cosmos, but we don't know enough. And that's so similar to how we feel when we're grieving. We don't know anything anymore. There is a huge feeling of ego annihilation. You're catapulted into a place where nothing makes sense, nothing looks the same, nothing can be relied upon, and that's your hostile environment. That's space. That's it's impossible.
And that is a beautiful parallel, then, isn't it, for the internal state for her? That what you're saying is her external environment matches her internal environment. That they've put her in this place that is, like you say, hostile, utterly terrifying.
Yeah, absolutely. And as soon as we look at grief, we're looking at attachment. And why is that? Because there's something that we've lost, and what was our attachment to this lost person? In 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she wrote the seminal book on death and dying, and she named the 5 stages of grief: denial and isolation, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And these 5 stages, they've gone on to be really the bedrock of how we try to understand grief. And also in 1969, John Bowlby published Attachment and Loss. And in this book, he identified behaviours in the first year of life which maintain attachment, but also, more importantly for us, those related to separation, specifically crying and searching. Now, these behaviours, they increase the infant's chances of survival. So, if you cry if you're hungry, if you're lost, if you've lost your parent, the baby will search for the parent. So it makes sense that when a person is grieving, they return to these behaviours, these very primal biological ways of coping with death, the idea of how do we survive.
So it's like an acknowledgement, you're saying, the system's acknowledgement that I am in crisis.
Absolutely.
And that there has to be a recognition of the fact that you're in crisis in order to get yourself out of it. And that numbness that Ryan Stone has at the start is the antithesis of that, because she's given up.
There are so many different ways that a person will experience grief, and we all, that's one of the very unique things about grief. We do it differently, every single one of us, and that's because of so many different factors. It can be because of our personality, our attachment style, our relationship with the person that we're grieving, our internal working models, how we attach in life. One of the things about Sandra being in space is that, one of the identifying characteristics of grief is how we search for the lost person, that kind of pining, those awful pangs of grief, that come so suddenly, and often they feel so unbearable. And sometimes the only way to cope with that is this numbness. It is a reaction to that pain. And on the one level, we can see that that's what she's doing. She's absolutely numbed this pain, and at the same time, she's in space. She's searching. There's almost this unconscious metaphor of she's out there and she's looking for something in another world that perhaps she couldn't find on Earth.
Yeah, and she sort of did try to, didn't she, she says, I just drive. Because Matt Kowalski, George Clooney's character, is utterly rooted, isn't he? He's got country music on. Who's down there looking up at you? He says he's very rooted, very connected to Earth. And he says, what do you do? And she says, I just drive. She got the news of her daughter's death while she was driving. There's a sense then that, again, something that we do a lot. I might come back to this actually, unless now is the right time for it. That we go back to the point of crisis and we try and resolve it by finding a different ending somehow. And she's doing that every time she gets back in the car, is her trying to sort of rewrite the ending. That's not explicitly said in the film, but there's a lot of people who sit with me in the counselling room And they say, I don't understand why I'm doing this, or why do I keep going back to this point of pain, or why do I keep going back to this person, or why do I keep going back to that job that doesn't work, or people go back to the thing that's not working, and it confuses them, but their psyche is looking for a solution that it didn't have at the time.
Yes. And again, it's connected to the searching that we do, which is, they've shown now that there are parts of the brain when we grieve that are actually more active than other parts. And those are the parts that are almost looking for that reward, trying to search for something familiar, trying to remember what was lost. And she gets back in the car. That's the last time that she can remember having a live connection with her daughter. So she gets back into that place because it's familiar. And she drives. And then the flip side of that is, I just drive, she says. That's all I do. That's what I do. So there's an autopilot going on there, that the kind of the disengagement from the world, but at the same time there is searching.
And that's the part of the brain you're talking about that's lighting up, the part that is like a heightened searching.
Yes, so we're looking for the lost object. Every day our nervous system is conducting very sophisticated testing, deciding what to focus on, what to see, what to ignore. And this is our perception. And searching increases in grief because now the filter has to get specific. It has to locate someone who's no longer there. So we have to get rid of all the extraneous information, and we need to really kind of knuckle down on what we need to find this person. So the searching gets really intense. You kind of hear these stories of, how somebody who's grieving, the rest of their life kind of falls away. There's this tunnel vision, and that's exactly why. It's this kind of neurobiological part of us that's wired to find that person, because that's what makes us feel safe. Part of that pain, part of that absolute terrible, overwhelming pain that you feel when there's a loss of someone that you love, that the idea that you're not going to be able to survive it, that you don't know how to get through it, is sometimes what leads to the avoidance. I'm not going to be able to survive this, so I'm just not going to feel it. And the truth is, we have to go through this, because this is what life is. The sense of loss is endemic to the human experience. Grief is our response to that loss, but it's also a form of learning. We have to be able to understand how to do life again. And so when we delay the learning, when that mourning is interrupted by avoidance, we can get triggered very, very quickly, immediately, in certain situations, by certain people, certain events, and we can become flooded. And that trauma of the grief returns to us, and it almost feels as real, and sometimes even more so, because it is so heightened. We weren't expecting it. We've done such a good job of avoiding it, and we weren't expecting it in that particular scenario.
I think that was beautifully eloquent. That was really lovely. Yes, we can understand why there is a disconnect, why people feel safer in that avoidance space, but we have to re-engage. And back to the film, that's what she does, isn't it? People who haven't seen it, there is a beautiful scene where she finally gets some safety. She gets inside the International Space Station, which has been an ordeal in itself to get that far and then to get inside it. And in this weightless state, which is beautifully filmed, she's kind of in the atrium, really, of the International Space Station, and she sheds her spacesuit and she curls up in the fetal position while kind of gently spinning in space and falls asleep in the fetal position. It's like this sort of circular womb, isn't it? This kind of rebirth happens, and that feels like a shedding of it's a layer that she's taken off. Okay, I'm engaging in a different way. It is like a rebirth. I'm now going to start trying. I'm going to fight for my life.
I absolutely love. That's my favorite still image, if you like, of the movie. It's so beautiful. It's so artistically shot, and I love it because she's an embryo in her sac in that moment, and these are the two big CEOs, if you like, of life, of birth and death, and you know we know so much about birth, and we know so little about death, really. That image there, it almost, it's like it gives her permission. I'm getting in touch with every part of me, all the different parts of me, and I'm allowing myself to accept the part that's really terrified, that actually feels in danger because I've lost somebody, this person that I've loved. I've lost them, and I can feel so scared. I can feel like a little baby. Biologically, that's what happens to the infant. They feel in literal danger when they feel lost. And so her returning to that place as an adult in that moment, in that scene, for me, it's the human acceptance of all of our different parts and all of our different stages in life.
Oh, they're all culminating in that one moment.
Yeah.
There's a slightly different angle that you brought out there, as much as it is about a rebirth, that it is about a kind of consolidation, a kind of allowing, a revisiting. I think it's important. I think it's difficult for us as people to see and allow space for our own grief when it is as all-consuming, because it is agonising, isn't it? And we just want it over. And there is something very still about that scene, a kind of an acceptance that comes from it, of this is where I am. So I'm going to go back. I have to go right back to basics. I have to strip away all my expectations. I have to strip away all this avoidance, all this pretense. And I have to reconnect with myself, with all my experience, with everything.
Absolutely. We have so many assumptions of what life should be about and what it should look like and how we should feel in it. And she lost her child. It's not how we expect the order of things to go. It can almost feel, it feels wrong, in many ways, just biologically. And we grieve for these kinds of losses in different ways in different cultures as well. There are various different beliefs and expectations around mourning in different cultures. And I tend to think that, in Western societies, there can be a much more kind of stiff upper lip, let's just carry on. Let's just, do what we need to do. We can be sad for a little while, but not too long. And how long do we give ourselves for losing a child? There's something about permission, absolutely. When I look at that scene with her there, I think there's just permission for everything that we endure and that we experience here in this life. Life can be tough.
And therapy offers people that space, doesn't it? To really allow all of it to be.
Yeah, there's a point in the movie where Kowalski's radioing Houston, and Stone asks him, "What's the point if they can't hear us?" And he says, "Well, just because they can't hear, just because we can't hear Control, doesn't mean Control can't hear us." And it made me, think about that relationship, between the therapist and the client. The therapist doesn't always know if the client can hear them. And it might sometimes feel like it's radioing into the dark. But, he says it just could save their lives if they keep talking. And I like that, I like the idea of, sometimes we just have to keep talking. Just keep making that connection, just keep being there, just keep being present.
Let me come back to avoidance. You mentioned about her avoidance, that it is all she can do to keep breathing in space, well, in her life, because the space is the metaphor, isn't it? But all she can do is to just sever that part of her that is, I mean, broken's not even a strong enough word, is it? That has been utterly devastated by this. Also, there's something that the filmmakers do really well, that they make the death of the daughter, the way that she died, just really random and tragic. She just falls over in the playground at school. It's not like some dramatic, violent death. It's just something that could happen anywhere, at any time, to anyone. I think there's something about that I think is brave for the filmmakers. This could happen to you. This could happen to anybody. This is a simple loss. I think that in itself is brave and interesting move on their part. In terms of the avoidance, if we move on in the film just a little, there's a scene later on where she does give up. Something just goes so terribly wrong. She can't launch one of the landing pods or something? She can't launch from the Chinese space station that she then has to get to. And she just gives up. She turns down all the dials where she is. She turns everything off. It's, again, a metaphor, isn't it, for her just saying, I can't. I know that I'm supposed to re-engage and that's what I need to do, but I just can't do it. And then Matt Kowalski appears next to her, doesn't he? Because of course, what I've not mentioned is that he sacrifices himself for her life. He untethers himself from her because they tether themselves to each other. He untethers himself from her and goes off into space and sacrifices himself for her survival. Anyway, then he reappears in this moment, and he's obviously not there because he's dead. But she hears him say, I get it. It's beautiful. It's safe. And there's nobody up here that can hurt you. And he's acknowledging, I think that's such a powerful moment because he's giving voice to the thing that has been unvoiced until now, which is, I understand why you're doing this. And you need to at some point re-engage. And it's an invitation to her, isn't it, to try. What do you think?
Yeah. There's so many points in what you've just said. Where shall I start? So, okay, first the randomness. Anything can happen in this life. We might have an idea, we might construct an order of things, but actually, the only order is randomness. There's something, very deliberate actually about that. She's enjoying this weightlessness up in space. And it was actually gravity that pulled this little girl to the ground and ended her life. And this is the truth, that living can be so unpredictable. Anything can happen. And at any point we can stop being pulled to the earth and it just stops. She says to Kowalski at one point, one of her bolts that she needs to fix the telescope falls and starts floating around in space, and he grabs it and she apologizes and says, I'm used to a lab, when my bolt's falling to the floor. And that same thing that she's used to has taken her daughter. It's worked another way. There's such a shock factor to grief. We don't expect it. We know it. We know the thing that is the most certain in this world is that we will die, but we don't expect it. Almost our unconscious cannot process it. So there is such a shock, such a confusion for her. There's such an emptiness. And so she struggles. She struggles in space to get back to Earth, but also to get back to herself. That's the metaphor here. And that's one of the aspects of the grieving process. How do I reintegrate? Stone has got difficulty getting back to Earth, reintegration. And how do we do that? How do we start living again? How do we launch ourselves and to land? And he says, did you try the soft landing jets? And she says, they're for landing. And he says, landing is launching. It's the same thing. You just got to begin. So it's funny because when he enters her pod and he gives her that speech, there's something about it. He says, I get it. It's nice up here. You know, you can just shut down all the systems, turn out all the lights, and just close your eyes and tune out everybody. You know, that's what she's been doing. She's on autopilot. She's not been living. She's not been engaging. She's been driving. She's just been working. She doesn't know how to live without her daughter. There's nobody up here that can hurt you. It's safe. I mean, what's the point of going on, he says. What's the point of living? And when I'm hearing him talk to her, because, you know, I'd only seen, that was the first time I'd seen the movie, I thought, this is really harsh. I didn't for a second think it was a hallucination. I didn't actually know. I thought maybe he'd, you know, found his way back to her. And I thought, you know, I see what you're saying. I know exactly what you want her to do, but, you know, it feels, you should go a little bit gentler. When I realized that this is a part of her. This is that part of her that is needing to be harnessed, needing to be located, needing to be found. Yes, she's hallucinating. Yes, she's suffering from a lack of oxygen, you know, carbon monoxide poisoning, all the rest of it. But she is also having to overcome the adversity. She has to go to a place within her psyche she might not want to go to, she might not have been before. She's really having to summon something from herself, and she has summoned him so that he can sit down next to her like a life coach and tell her what she needs to hear. So she's talking to herself so that she can start living again.
And they present it as a beautiful peacefulness, don't they? Because she does just turn off all the buzzing, bleeping alerts, and there's a real peacefulness. And the suggestion is that life is violent, living is violent, choosing to engage is a kind of, there's a force, life force. It is a forceful thing. We have to work hard at living, at being engaged, at being present. That is not easy, that life is difficult. And I love that, the contrast, and perhaps we'll come later to her re-entering the Earth's atmosphere and the violence of that, and the loudness of it, and how she feels about that. It's again, one of my favourite scenes. But the contrast, why wouldn't you want to just slip away? I when she was just turning off all those dials and shutting her eyes and disappearing, just fading away, so much of me was going, well, of course you would. Of course, that's exactly what you would do. You would just let yourself drift off, because to re-engage is so much harder.
I like that. It's harder, you know, it's harder to work at life. It does often feel like that for a lot of people, especially when they're grieving. It feels really, really difficult. There are so many complications that come with grieving. There's such a loneliness often. Grief also knocks on the door of other losses. So if there are other losses which have not been processed, and often we don't, you know, we can feel the impact of that even more intensely, and it can feel so difficult. So yes, the most extreme form of coping with grief would be suicide, would be this idea of just shutting the systems down and not trying anymore.
Yeah, drifting off into a peaceful place. I think it's important that we definitely, you were saying then that one grief can stimulate our experiences of other griefs. And maybe it's important to say that grief is not necessarily about death either. That we can grieve for missing people that aren't necessarily dead, or hope that we've lost. That it's not just about grief. Would you agree?
Definitely.
Not just about loss, sorry, not just about death.
I mean, I don't always even go to death when I think of grief, to be honest. I think of loss. That's the first place I go to when I think of grief, and I think that we lose things every day. You can lose your keys. You can, you know, that can screw up your day. You know, you can, you know, lose your phone. You can lose money. You can lose a job. You can lose a friendship. You know, the friend is still out there in the world, but no longer in the same way. Grief is about loss. It's, yeah, absolutely. And the world that we're living in at the moment, you know, we're almost constantly having to decide how to attend to a level of grief. There are wars, there is crime, there's we live through a pandemic. There's illness, random deaths without explanation. So we are, whether we consciously understand this or not, we are deciding daily what to do about loss.
I don't know whether this is even going to link to the way you finished that, but the way you started it, you were talking about all the things that you can lose. And I suppose I want to ask, maybe open a conversation about what happens if we don't grieve then, because avoidance is not the only coping strategy for grief that isn't, for want of a better word, maladaptive, that is unhelpful. So she goes to avoidance, Ryan Stone goes to avoidance, but if we don't process these losses, like the loss of a friendship, I think it came from when you were talking about loss of a friendship, that if we don't process those griefs, then we can then, that will then bleed into the relationships that we form with other people too. So we might control other people, we might cling to other people, we might be so frightened of loss that we that we become exaggerated in our attachment need, that we become incapable of living without somebody right by our side, up close in front of us, that need to become attached, to use the word that you used earlier. So she avoids, she cuts herself loose. There's an avoidance in that, but there is a more anxious attachment, isn't there, that makes people pull other people to them, and it can feel perhaps claustrophobic for other people, for the other ones who are being pulled towards. And so unprocessed grief and loss doesn't always propel people, does it, into avoidance? It can propel people into a sort of clingy, grabby state. I wonder if you have any comments about that.
Well, it makes me think about the different attachment styles, actually. Loss is shaped by many factors, one of them being our internal working models of relationships. So this involves our expectations of others, of ourselves, and it leads us to how does our attachment style have us show up in the world? And, perhaps a more avoidant attachment style might be unconsciously feeling, I'm not going to get the care that I need. So there's an emotional system shutdown, a pushing away of people. Maybe a different kind of person, a more anxious attachment style. There might be a real kind of overwhelm with the thoughts and the feelings and the memories, a kind of intense rumination. It might be really hard to do anything else, actually, but almost fixate, and maybe that can lead to the dependency, that clinginess that you're talking about. The secure attachment style is perhaps what we hope for finding eventually, is a kind of dual process of grieving, where we can stay connected in life with an acceptance of what we have lost. And that makes me think about one of the stages of grief that Kubler talks about, which is the denial. There's lots of fables and stories that, people talk about when they think about grief. And the one that I like is called The Peach Blossom Spring. It's a Chinese fable, and it's about a fisherman, and he sails into this idyllic utopia, and everything is wonderful. I don't think people age. Everybody is happy. There's luscious fruits, fertile foliage. It's all wonderful. But he can never find it again. And he tries, and he goes back time and time again, looking for this village that he found once that he can never find again. And I think that's for me such a big part of this process. How do we accept that the world looks different, our world looks different, that this land is lost?
That's a really beautiful fable. What's it called again?
The Peach Blossom Spring.
And that we're all searching basically for that original bliss.
Stone gets back into the car and, listens to the radio station and wants to be back in that place, as you were saying. Exactly. searching for that time where it felt different, the world looked different.
There's that line that Kowalski comes out with, and I can't remember exactly where it is. I think it's when she's trying to get into the International Space Station, quite near the beginning, and she's clinging on to the outside. She's clinging on in space, not refusing to get into the space station. And he says, "You're going to have to learn to let go."
Oh yes, he does.
You've got to learn to move away from this. You can't stay here. This life here is impossible, and that's it. So yes, you can stay here, but you're not living. You're not thriving.
I love that line. It is so heartbreaking to hear him say it. And at the same time, I love that he said it, because there was just something so compassionate. It's the kind of thing that you want a friend to eventually say to you, you're going to have to learn to let go, when he or she has allowed you to be in that space for as long as is possibly beneficial, maybe. And after a while, we can get stuck. We can get stuck in that grief, and we actually sometimes need someone to say to us, you have to learn to let go.
And it's gentle. That's what you're saying.
Really,
it's a gentle.
Yeah, really, really. It has to be, because it's not something that we don't know, but it is something that we have actively avoided doing for a very long time, because we don't think we can.
What a beautiful thing to be able to offer somebody that you love when you see them drifting. To be able to be the person that can risk kind of being told off by your friend, but to risk being able to say to them, "You're lost, come back. It's worth fighting for. You are loved. There's enough here." I think that's hard for people. I think Matt Kowalski makes it look easy.
Well, yes, I mean, he has that ability, George Clooney, doesn't he? But
he doesn't.
Interestingly, this kind of gentleness that you and I are talking about, in some ways, we're picking it up. We're bringing it into wider society. In 2022, the DSM recognized prolonged grief disorder, and they added it as a condition. Now, this is an interesting conversation, because there are many societies and countries that would grieve, and they will grieve for years, and it's not a disorder, it's not a condition, it's just life. What crying, grieving is a very normal response to this kind of loss in life. So, who are we to call it a disorder? But at the same time, there's something about us recognizing that there are people in pain, and that maybe these people in pain are suffering in silence, and maybe they're not getting help, and maybe they're not talking about it. And by us naming it, we're actually talking about it. We're actually giving permission for people to say, I'm struggling here, and I need help. I'm stuck. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, agreed. I find it fascinating that the pivotal moment is crisis. It's the threat to her own life, which is what gives her that stark, are you living or are you dying? What are you doing here? So the crisis is kind of her redemption, I suppose. And it's the thing that the starter gun that actually begins her journey back to what Kowalski calls Mother Earth. It's the crisis, that life or death, when your life is threatened. All right, what are you going to do when the chips are down? This is your choice. And of course she nearly does, doesn't she? Just retreat and die. But maybe now would be a good time to talk about that rebirth and that re-entry to Mother Earth, that journey back that is loud and messy.
The etymological root of survival is the Latin supervivere, and which is we live beyond, to outlive. This is interesting because, like I said before, our unconscious doesn't understand death. We see it in our dreams, and in our dreams we might sit and have dinner with our long deceased father, for example, but it's not something that we consciously understand. So how we approach death, how there's a resistance, a very strong resistance to it. It's not something that I can logically, consciously comprehend. There's this line in the movie where Kowalski comments on the view, on the sunset. What he's referring to is a moment where something beautiful is able to be recognized in the darkness. You know, in modern times, we refer to the dark night of the soul. And this comes from the 16th century mystic and poet St. John of the Cross, who was referring to a phase of passive purification at the point where God's presence is felt, but it's not stable. We often turn to God, to religion in times of grief. Why are we doing that? We're looking for help. We're looking to get some kind of, find a rope, if you like, that's going to pull us out of this darkness, of this pit that we're in. And so that hallucination that she has, you know, with Kowalski in the pod, you know, she's needing to find her own higher self to help her out and allow her to reintegrate. And it is so scary. She says to him, you know, she's only landed on a simulator, and that she's crashed every time. So, you know, what she's saying here is, I've never done this for real. And in a way, she's saying, you know, I don't know how to live, but the truth is, we do it every day. We sometimes don't give ourselves enough credit for what we do, what we are doing. So actually, she's having to summon so much courage, really overcome so much fear to make that re-entry. And you're absolutely right. When it begins, it is loud. I mean, the film itself is quite quiet in many places. You know, it's one of the kind of you know, hallmarks of this movie, the silence and space. But it gets loud. It is violent. It is shocking. There are there's that kind of space jet sound, and she says, you know, she doesn't know if she's going to make it.
And there's fire everywhere. She says, either way, it'll be one hell of a ride. She doesn't know whether she's going to live or die, but she's laughing. And she's shaking and bouncing around in the seat. Yeah, that is life. Loud and messy, unavoidably confronting. And she has decided that she has to do that she can't do the silent drifting away. It's such a stark contrast, isn't it? It's quite assaulting, that scene where the pod is going through the Earth's atmosphere and you're rooting for her to survive it.
And you know, one of the things that we can lose in grief is that it's a loss of creativity, the joy of what gives us purpose, what gives us meaning, why, you know, what puts a smile on our face in the morning. And you're right, she's laughing. She's going to give it a go. She doesn't know what's going to happen. She's finally saying, I don't need a guarantee here. There are none, but I'm here and that's enough. Yeah, there's something about her getting back in touch with that creative part of herself.
How is it creative? Because creativity is about an openness, about a willingness.
Yeah, it's about not necessarily knowing where you're going to end up, I think. It's
So faith, trust.
Yes, and joy. She is laughing because she has surmounted something that she felt was insurmountable, and there is a pride in that. There is something wonderful in feeling like we can do it, we have done it. And in that moment, she feels that. She feels that pride in herself.
And let me invite you then to close this episode by talking about the moment where she lands. She lands in the water. I'm gonna leave an open door here for you. Tell me your perspectives on that. 'Cause again, another powerful scene where she lands in the water. So much symbolism.
When she lands in Earth, in the water on Earth, her pod is flooded. And that was the point. I'd been silent like the movie up until that point, and then I gasped out loud because I just thought, no, they are not going to do this. They are not going to end this here. She can't have survived that entire ordeal in space, only, you know, to literally crash and burn now. And I was so worried for her. And it's that moment where she is having to find that last give it that last push. You've come this far, and she has to absolutely really want it, and she does. And she has decided to live. And when she opens up the pod and she just falls onto the sand, she is exhausted, as you would imagine. She is relieved. There is such relief for her. And she tries to stand. And that is the metaphor. That is what this whole ride, this whole life, this whole process of living is all about. Even though she wobbles, and even though it's hard for her to do it, she has to learn to stand on her own 2 feet. And she does.
Tentatively, like you say, shakily.
Yeah.
But she does.
Yeah.
And there's a very interesting camera angle, because what they do is they take the camera right down to the ground and they look up at her, and she looks, in all her shakiness, she looks powerful, doesn't she? I think she's a tall woman, isn't she? But she's not a big, imposing figure at all. There's something quite unimposing about Sandra Bullock's stature, I think. But they make her look really strong and determined, and she stands rooted. And the fact they've got her in this kind of muddy sand means that her feet just sink a little bit, so she is absolutely in contact with the earth. And like you say, 2 feet on the ground, which is what Kowalski said in Space, isn't it? You're going to have to start living your life 2 feet on the ground. That's what he says to her.
Yeah.
And there she is, her 2 feet in the mud. And maybe that's it. It's not, maybe it is mud rather than sand. Everything is dirty, and she still has this stature, this power.
Everything is dirty. Life is messy. It is. You have to get stuck in. And one of the things about Sandra Bullock, which I love, is she's that girl next door, and so there's something around, this could happen to anyone. She might be a brilliant medical engineer and an astronaut, but actually she's not doing anything different to what any of us might need to do one day and can do. There's something about the fact that in grief we can sometimes feel so lonely, but actually it's the one thing that really connects us all. It happens to all of us.
You speak so eloquently about such enormous concepts, such enormous feelings. I have so much more to say, but I feel like that's such a beautiful place to end. What do you think?
Yeah.
Thanks for being with us this episode. The B-side, which takes one aspect of this episode and digs a little deeper into how that might be explored in the therapy room, will drop very soon. In the meantime, if you'd like to have more of our conversations and metaphorical excavations, it would be grand for you and grand for us if you would subscribe to the podcast or share a favourite episode with a friend. There's something really exciting I want to share with you all. I've been looking for a way to make it easy for you folks to get in touch that isn't social media, and I'm delighted to say that I've found it, and it's really easy for you to use too. Just go to the show notes and you'll see the link. It just says send me a text message. Click that and you'll be taken through the process. Please know that the function is one way only, but while I can't reply to you directly, I do read all the messages, and I am excited to respond to some of your comments in the podcast in the future. Of course, you could also use this feature to share with me any ideas you might have for future episodes. I look forward to hearing from you.